JR, can you recall your first experience with racism?
I don't know which one came first, but I can remember two specific instances. Should I share them?
Yeah, share, please.
Okay, so the first one that I remember was my parents were going to get their wills made, and so they went to the attorney's office, and I was with them. And the first thing the attorney looked at me and said, "What crime did he commit?" So that was one of the first ones when they were, and what made it even worse was the attorney was black. So so that, I don't know if that was racism or not, but that was the first time that I was like, oh, this like, in hindsight years later, I thought I realized it. Mm-hmm. And then also was just like elementary school, the teachers, where they would just make stuff up. Like, I was a brand new kid in school. When you're a brand new student in school, you don't talk to anyone. Mm-hmm. You don't say anything to anybody. You keep quiet. And the teacher called home like 3 times that week saying I was disrupting the class. And it was just like, oh, you're picking on the black kids. Okay. Get it, because then my parents talked to some of the other parents, and it was like, this is consistent with this teacher. So I think those were the first two. I don't remember which one happened first, but those would be my first experiences.
Wow.
I've got more.
I got that dish.
Hold just pause on that one, because we're gonna get into some of those things.
I got that dish.
Yeah.
Dish. I got that dish. I got that dish. That dish.
Hey y'all, it's Onika
And JR.
and you are dishing with Dainty Dish. How you doing today, JR?
I'm doing well. I'm back on that 9 to 5 grind. So, I mean, I'm a working person again.
Yeah.
Well, I'm working for the man. That's what I'm doing. I'm not working for myself.
Well,
So, it happens.
like, it happens. It's a thing.
It's short term.
It's short term.
It's short term.
It's not a long term thing. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. But how are you doing? I haven't seen you in a month.
I know it's been a while. Life's been a little crazy hectic, and haven't been feeling my 100% best. So I apologize if I'm not giving you all my 100%.
Oh, don't
today.
do that. No. Do not start apologizing for things. No, look. Give your 100%.
You're right.
And stop making excuses.
Give it all I've got. And you know what? I'm gonna give my 100% today because we've got a guest on the show today.
We've got a very special
yes,
guest.
we do. Dr. Onye Nnorom.
Hello, thank you for having me.
How are you doing today, Onye? Dr. Onye, I should say.
Yeah, we got to keep this respectful.
Keep it respectful.
When you go to school, to get a title, and you've put the work in, we're gonna address you by that title. That's what happens here. Yes.
So I'm doing very well today, and I appreciate that. But it's cool. You can just call me Onye, Dr. Onye.
It's cool. Like that was
like
super
we're gonna
hyped up.
We're
We're gonna be official. Yeah. So, Dr. Onye, you're doing well today. You said.
I am. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling blessed, and very honored to be here. So I'm glad this worked out. I'm happy to be here.
I've been trying to get you on here for a while. You're very elusive. You're a very elusive character.
I am. My schedule is always running after me. Like, I think people run after their schedules. Mine runs after me. So I'm always super booked, but I'm glad that we were able to make it happen.
We could find the time to do this today. And today we're going to talk about, it might be a sensitive topic to some people. The question at the top of the hour when I was talking to JR was, what was his first experience with racism? And today we're going to talk about racism and mental health.
Yes, and so that is a topic that I really am passionate about. I did experience racism at a very young age, in elementary school, as you mentioned. And basically now that I am a doctor, a physician, I spend a lot of my time focusing, advocating, writing and speaking about how racism affects our health, mental health and physical health, but they're both very much connected, as we all know.
Absolutely. So, doctor,
Are you at a loss for words?
I'm at a bit of loss for words.
Oh my god, let's just get this started. I'm just gonna start because we had a little bit of a quick production meeting before, but let's just dig in. So you're a physician. How did you get to where you are today as a advocate and someone, I guess, because you just said you came back from a speaking engagement recently. So how did you go from medical student to public speaker, and what happened in between? Like, what kind of things happen to get you there?
So that's an interesting question, because I think the answer is God's grace, right? Because I think all of us have gifts naturally, and we end up having different opportunities and different people come into our lives to make it such that we might be able to have the opportunity to use our gifts in ways to give back or to give to community. And so for me, public speaking, I had always been interested in public speaking. So that is like from childhood, right? Mm-hmm. Like I was that little kid who talked and talked all the time. And then I'd be like, when people would tell me to be quiet, I'd say, God gave me a mouth to talk and I can use it anytime I want, right? I can't remember who had taught me that, but that was my answer. And second to that is, experiencing racism. I was talking about racism in elementary school. So where, a lot of kids for show and tell would bring in, I guess, grass or a leaf or something to talk about. I was coming in talking about like apartheid in South Africa. And
wow.
Talking about Nelson Mandela and Malcolm X. And the way that happened was because at a very young age, I experienced racism, right? I grew up in Montreal. We lived in a very, a lower income mixed neighborhood. But when I was 6 years old, we moved to the suburbs, right? Like that dream that, my dad's from Nigeria, my mom's from Trinidad, like the immigrant dream, we moved to the suburbs, the house, the whole thing. But I was the only Black kid on the street. And so I experienced, a lot of isolation of kids not wanting to play with me. When I started school, I had, I think it was grade 2, a teacher similar to what you described who kind of targeted me and gave me kind of lower grades, and my mom had to advocate. So my parents, God bless them, did a really awesome thing. They didn't tell me to ignore it. They were like, this is racism. People are doing things because you are Black, but Black is beautiful. And like, here's all these books to learn about that. Mm-hmm. So I grew up you read my essays or stories, I guess, from elementary school, and it says, I'm going to stop racism because it had impacted me so profoundly at a really young age. So fast forward through time, when I was fortunate enough to become part of a mentorship program for young people who are interested in medicine, I was really excited to go into medical school, but I was still involved in community work, refugee work, all of this stuff. And in that process of learning, I realized that racism isn't just a social justice issue. It isn't just something that makes us upset and something that we need to advocate around, but it actually affects our health, because that stress, that being upset, that day-to-day grind that you have to work twice as hard, that feeling of, oh, I'm going to have an interview or job interview. How do I sit? How do I stand? What if they're racist? All of that runs through our minds affects our mental and physical health. So once I realized that during my training, I said, this is how everything has lined up. And so the public speaking came in from that. The advocacy was already there. And so I feel very blessed to be able to do that and to be part of some changes in addressing structures of injustice or anti-Black racism.
So which groups do you, what age groups do you work with typically? Do you work with the children to try and change the future, or do you work with the adults to try and, change their mindsets? Like what's really the focus?
So most of my work now is with young adults.
Okay.
So people in their 20s. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it is, for instance, in the medical school. So I'm the Black Health Theme Lead for the medical school at the University of Toronto. So I teach, people who are going to become physicians about how health is impacted by racism. So a lot of it, although I'm focusing on the Black population health, I'm letting them know that a lot of the differences we see in society, for instance, differences in high blood pressure, where you'll see Black people experience higher rates of blood pressure or other conditions, or even if it's a genetic condition like sickle cell, not get the type of treatment that they should receive, or get delays in care, or not being prescribed the appropriate amount of pain medication. All of that happens in healthcare, but also outside of healthcare. I teach that to the medical students so that they know how to do better when they're in that position. The other area I teach is in public health, so people working out in community, or health promoters who might be working for different agencies to engage youth or children, or sometimes adults, but I will teach them about how racism affects our health as well. And then from time to time, I am invited to go to different medical conferences and teach, people who are more senior or leaders on these issues.
What are the challenges in I guess, teaching young doctors? Because I'm assuming I may be wrong, but I'm pretty confident there's got to be a little bit of an arrogance when you've gone to medical school and you've put in the work and you're like, now you got that white coat or you're about to get that white coat. And do you really want to have someone tell you that the way you think might be racist or causing, like, I guess the Hippocratic Oath says do no harm. Like, so how hard is it to talk to someone saying to a medical professional, a doctor, upcoming doctor, and saying you might be causing harm?
It actually is surprisingly very, very rewarding to teach this to the younger generation. I would say the resistance I get is with the older doctors because they're like, oh, I know, right? And then I'm there to say, oh, no, you don't know, right? There's the way that you might be conducting yourself, both in the clinic or just outside in general, might be creating microaggressions, might be things that create insults for people and make life harder for people who are minorities or racialized or immigrants. So I would say the difficulty more is with the more established doctors. With the young doctors, they're coming in, or the people who are training to be doctors, they're coming in during a time. This is, I would say, very much like if you read about the 1960s, right? A time of change and advocacy, right? So we're hearing about issues affecting so many different groups, LGBTQ groups. We'll hear about Black Lives Matter. Like, they're seeing this on TV. They will hear about Idle No More and what's going on with Indigenous health and Truth and Reconciliation. So when we bring this, that they're hearing in the social environment or social media, they're seeing it on TV anyways, and saying this is relevant to what's going on in the hospital, but also relevant as far as the lived experiences of the patients you are going to see, that, basically being denied opportunities because of race, being more likely to have a lower income because of a race, and also learning that there's actually no major biological differences between the races, like it's all basically a social construct. We as a society have created these differences, and these differences make people sick. Teaching them that really opens their minds, and they're like, wow, I never knew that, and it makes what they're hearing in social media that much more relevant. But I would say for the doctors who are already practicing, who grew up thinking like, oh yes, like, white people are genetically different than Black people. And so all of the disparities, all of the problems, the higher blood pressure, the diabetes, or what have you, that you'll see Black people experience across North America and other racialized groups, they'll think, oh, it's because it's either genetic or those communities don't eat well or don't do things properly, or, the list goes on and on. There's something wrong with those people, whereas actually there's something wrong with the system. We have a system that privileges certain people, and historically that has been people of white European descent, and a system that causes disadvantage to other people who are denied the same types of opportunities. And so the stress of that day after day after day creates wear and tear, can make people depressed, can make people anxious, can even give people post-traumatic stress disorder. But also, like I said, you could have the physical manifestations where your hormones are out of whack and you're basically in like fight or flight, kind of, high cortisol, and that raises blood pressure over time. So that's a harder sell with the older doctors who have really ingrained ways of thinking about these things. Whereas with the young people, that's what gives me hope. They're like bright-eyed and they're willing to learn, and they're like agents of change. They're amazing.
But that sounds like two things. So that the fact that the younger doctors or medical students are actually surprised that this kind of stuff is happening, and they take it in as like, oh, I'm shocked, I didn't know that was happening. That, number one, is super scary to me. And number two, you touched on food. And so what about is there any relation between food and our health, and how I guess minorities, people of color, Black people, how food affects their health? Like, is it? Can you say that it's not necessarily racism, but it's the food that we eat? like the traditional foods? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, so I wouldn't point the finger at traditional foods per se, but we already know. So again, let's use high blood pressure as an example. So regardless of race, we know people who are living in like lower income circumstances, people who are poorer, have higher rates of blood pressure and don't eat as well. So nutrition or diet and outcome, and health definitely go together. What you're putting in definitely affects your health, right? Your health outcomes. But if you're living in conditions where you can't afford healthy foods, then that will affect your health regardless of race or culture. Now, what's commonly spoken about is that, certain cultural diets are not as healthy as they should be. That could be the case, but that's true for a North American diet as well, right? Particularly the fast food, all of that, right? Like that's North American, not specific to a racialized or minority culture. But another factor that we do know is that when we have people who are immigrants, so which in this country largely are people of color, right? So racialized, whether South Asian, Chinese, or African or Caribbean background, etc. So just to be inclusive, all the different groups. But when people immigrate to this country, so we're not talking about refugee claimants, but when people immigrate, they have to show that they have a good bill of health. So what we see is people come in with eating their cultural foods. They come into the country and experience a lot of different barriers, but also adopt like the more North American diet. So there's many factors, but what we see over time is what you call the healthy immigrant effect, or it should actually be called the unhealthy immigrant effect, which is that within about 10 years, those immigrants have poorer health outcomes. So now start to get diagnosed with high blood pressure, diabetes, other conditions that they didn't have when they first arrived. So the issue is not necessarily our cultural diet per se, but what happens here, either that you can't afford, the best diet, that plant-based diet that you might have had, or it's, as I mentioned, that wear and tear of being denied opportunities, which becomes even more complicated for somebody who's a newcomer to the country, because now not only are you worried about like racism in your race, but also issues of cultural racism where basically you're, not having that European or Canadian accent, or not having those cultural norms that are very much considered the norm here, but really are kind of the European British perspective. If you don't have those cultural norms, when you go to an interview, you're going to experience other forms of discrimination. So that stress and everyday grind does have an impact on people's health.
Hey, Onika, how are you doing over there?
I'm doing well, just taking it all in. You mentioned stress as an inducer to when it comes to racism. What exactly is that correlation? Can you explain that to me a little bit deeper in regards to stress and racism?
Sure. So, stress is an interesting topic in and of itself because, let's just, not speaking about racism necessarily, right? Let's just talk about stress in general. We know that there's good stress and there's bad stress, right? Good stress can be, if you are, you have a test at school and you studied for it, but, while you're writing it, it's a little bit stressful, but you have the ability to, do well. You've been given the resources, you can overcome it, or you're running a race, or you're at a party. There's all different types of stress that we can have, but where we feel that we have the ability to overcome it or succeed, then that can be good stress, right? It doesn't mean that we have to live a life that's entirely stress-free. There's no such thing, and it probably wouldn't be good for you. But where we're talking about this type of stress with racism, we're talking about bad stress. We're talking about the stress where you don't feel like you have any control. You don't feel like you can change your outcomes. You feel stuck. And so that can happen to a person. And so, it's common with racism, but also other forms of discrimination. It could be heterosexism. It could be gender discrimination, like all types of, basically when you feel like you're being treated unfairly. There have been a lot of research in this area showing that can create, for a person, an environment in which they are chronically, by chronic I mean long-term, in this state of fight or flight. So basically you're agitated, almost like, back in the day it would have been like, okay, like a lion just roared at you, like everything goes up, right? Your heartbeat, your blood pressure, everything goes up. But, a long time ago, that was like for you to just run away from danger. But when that threat is there, just, in the environment at a low level, day after day after day, and your body is responding in this way day after day after day, then that takes a toll. It kind of just, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. You know what I mean? It's not, so it's, when you're walking through the hallway, or you mentioned when you were a kid and the lawyer says, which is, by the way, internalized racism. So he's internalized the racism about his group. Oh, what crime did he commit? Yeah. So those everyday slights, or even if you were born here and because you were the little black kid in class, being asked constantly, oh, where are you from? Where are you from? That implicit, feeling like you don't belong, right? Just experiencing this day after day after day can take a toll on somebody. So it can take a toll on mental health. So once you're exposed to it, especially I would say at a young age, it's different if somebody comes from another country and then starts to experience this as an adult. But particularly where you experience it as a child, then it accumulates over time, right? It builds up over time so that you will have somebody sometimes lose it, right? So, just kind of like lose their cool because time after time after time, this is like the 17th person to, either assume that I've done something wrong or follow me in the store or what have you. And so you can have kind of like an out of proportion reaction, but it's not because of that one security guard who followed you that day. It's because of that whole lifetime of it. You can have feelings of anxiety or depression, or you can withdraw, which is a common thing, right? So a lot of people you'll see that with trauma as well, where somebody has a major trauma event, but this is kind of like a long-term experience where people will withdraw. So they might, if they're at school, just stop participating, or at work, like stop engaging in the meetings or being part of community because they're constantly ignored. I've been at, talks where people talked about just being at a board meeting and bringing up issues of racism, and then later looking at the minutes and seeing that none of what they described was recorded in the minutes, right? Wow. So that's another kind of microaggression, right? So then sometimes people will just withdraw. They won't participate. They won't vote, right? It's like, you have made me feel like I don't count, so F it, right? But that in and of itself, disengagement, not trusting, saying, quote unquote, all those people or the dominant group are the same. The research has shown that sits with you in your system. And so that's not healthy either. It really increases over time levels of stress. So what people need is ways to engage, ways to connect, have peers who understand, be engaged in change. Usually that's some form of advocacy or, feeling like you have some ways of addressing what's going on. So being given the tools and being part of an environment, like let's say it's a school, where that institution is open to that change and not continuing to perpetuate those policies or procedures or work cultures that are harmful to people. So that's basically how that stress works. It's that feeling that you don't have control over your outcome. You cannot overcome it, and that will take a toll on you over time.
So what are some ways to manage that type of stress so that you don't push yourself to the limit? Or if you feel like you have been pushed to the limit, what are some things that you can do to kind of relieve some of that stress?
So there's some ways that are just the regular ways that you hear about on the news, like for everybody, for dealing with stress, right? So things like thinking about gratitude, right? So that's been shown in the evidence to reduce people's levels of stress and also increase levels of happiness. So even if there are injustices that we face in our lives, let's say particularly as Black people, we can perhaps think about our ancestors and all of those who came before us and their struggles that they had and what they have done so that we have what we have today.
Absolutely.
So I do reflect on that. I think about myself as a Black woman, and with all of the, intelligence and resources and everything that I have, if I was born 100 years ago, my outcomes would be very different. And so I do reflect on, those Black women, both related to me and not related to me, and what they have experienced. And so I engage in gratitude. The other things you can do are mindfulness. So just really taking a moment, deep breathing. There's good evidence even for taking 3 minutes of slow breathing and just covering one nostril. So it forces you to engage in deep breathing can sometimes help. And then there's good evidence also for looking for peer support. So, really talking to other people, even if it's not about racism, it might be a colleague who experiences discrimination, a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, another colleague who might be from LGBTQ community, a colleague who is indigenous, like having somebody that you can engage in those discussions with and have it validated so that you're not necessarily speaking to somebody who's like, well, maybe they didn't mean anything by that, right? Because that recreates the trauma. And then finally seeking meaning. And so that's where I said where you can collaborate with others or become part of a group where you're addressing these issues. And it might not be that you're part of like an official anti-racism group. It could be that you're part of just a community group that's doing something for youth, or it could be that you're part of a group that's, a cultural group. But, finding ways to feel like you are part of some form of change, of some form of betterment, also is linked to reducing not only stress, but actually increasing levels of happiness when you're, in that zone. So there are things that you can do. And as I said, at the beginning when I talked about gratitude of, I think about the Black woman 100 years ago. With my work, I also think about the Black woman 100 years from now, right?
Yeah.
And I say, oh, wow, I'll be damned if she's going through what I go through, because those Black women 100 years ago, I don't even know the pain that they experienced. So even though, as much as I'm a physician, I experience a lot of barriers and sit at a lot of tables and places and spaces where I'm the only person of color, let alone, Black woman. But I think about, okay, well, I'm trying to make those changes so that she is, even more free.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, what you're doing right now, it's considered groundbreaking work. There's not a lot of this work going on right now in Canada from what I've read. Now, how do we solve that problem? What are some suggestions you can make to physicians out there that are looking to collect data or, be more informed when it comes to racism and mental health?
So the work that I'm involved in is newer in Canada, but there are so many people doing this work at different levels, right? And that is something that I definitely want to acknowledge, because this work has been going on for decades, right? Within communities, within Black communities and Indigenous communities, like really engaging in resilience and community resilience and different forms of resistance and different forms of wellness. So, I'm just doing it in a different form, in formal medicine or Western medicine, but we would not be here if it wasn't for the brilliance in our communities as far as people doing this type of work on the ground. So I want to acknowledge that. I want to really give credit to that work. But within formal medicine, it is a new area and needs to continue. So there's a lot of really great work going on also internationally. So, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK just 2 months ago released an official policy statement on how racism affects mental health. And specifically, they spoke to Black, African and Caribbean communities as a priority group in England. We were talking about childhood experiences of racism. And so in the United States, the American Academy of Pediatrics just released a major policy statement on racism, mental and physical health, but thinking about youth and different ways to address it. So those are going on outside. Within Canada, I know, for instance, there has been a lot of work since the United Nations came here. So they had a working group for people of African descent. For those who don't know, we are in the decade for people of African descent. So it's like 2014 to 2025, the decade of all people of African descent. So the whole diaspora.
I've never heard about that.
Yeah, it was declared by the United Nations. But with that came the working group who came in 2017 to speak to Black communities and Black leaders, and they reported that anti-Black institutional racism is very much ingrained in our institutions here in Canada.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. So, but them stating that internationally led to Justin Trudeau putting a few million aside for Black youth mental health initiatives. So I know that's going on. And with, in Ontario where we are, at least, the Anti-Racism Directorate, the City of Toronto, there's a lot of outreach and work going on around anti-Black racism. So it's starting to gain some momentum and awareness. Just last December, the Canadian Public Health Association also released a position statement that racism is a public health issue. So it's all very new. Everything that I'm saying to you is like probably in the last 24 months here in Canada, but it's happening. Recognition is happening. I think the biggest thing we need to be able to do, similar to the States and the UK, is start to collect more race-based data. Also in healthcare,
Really?
what happens?
So, okay.
We need to collect it. Yeah.
Really? You think so?
To measure racism. If you want to say that, for instance, there are not enough women in STEM, right? So like science, technology, engineering, and what's the last one? Medicine. That's ironic. In STEM research, that those groups are underrepresented because you collect the data.
But you can really make a correlation between saying that because there's women that are misrepresented in this particular group, that there needs to be more women in this particular group.
That's what's going on. I didn't decide that. There's a huge movement, but it's because we have the data to say there aren't enough women in, let's say, engineering.
Who defines that there's not enough women in engineering? Because if you look at women aren't going into
data.
Women aren't going into engineering because a lot of women that are very talented or smart choose to go into different fields. They don't want to go into engineering.
But why? See, so that's part of the issue, where you see a certain pattern. That's how systemic discrimination often works, right? So you could even, we'll talk about Blacks in medicine and other areas as well. But it's where at a very young age, society starts to tell you, quote unquote, where you belong, right? So there's quite a bit of research around this.
I would strongly disagree with that.
You could, but also recognize perhaps a little bit of humility in being a male. I assume you self-identify as male?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I'm assuming, right? So I wanted to call it out. But as a woman at a very young age, we're kind of told that it's very implicit, because at first we're told that we could be whatever we want to be.
Okay, because I'm so familiar with the whole indoctrination in the public education system, where women are actually put on a pedestal and told they can do everything. We get rid of all the things that are beneficial to boys. So we get rid of physical activity. We get rid of the arts that boys will typically use their energy to kind of grow and make mistakes and become better people. But we've gotten rid of all that, and we've kind of said, no, we're gonna make this education system beneficial for women, and we're going to forget the boys. And I see that in the last 20 years, we've forgotten about boys.
And I would agree with that. So that is another issue within the education system, but it doesn't still account for what you see happen once people get to university, right?
Okay.
So once you get to the higher learning levels, all those girls who might have had that great self-confidence because they were good at math when they were younger, all of a sudden don't see role models. All of a sudden might experience, I'll say for medicine, for instance, right? All of a sudden, I could say for my in my 20s, my girls, when we would go out, we wouldn't say we were doctors, right? Or that we were saying, because guys often were not interested in...
guys don't care about your career.
Or no, but it's actually a turnoff, right? Like the guys would say, I'm a doctor, and everybody...
Well, when it comes down to, guys don't care about your career.
But that's it. But, if you didn't care, then it wouldn't matter what I said. But actually, it can be off-putting to hear, I'm a physician, or I have a PhD in physics, right? So a lot of women over time kind of start to think, oh, maybe that's not for me. It's just in the back of in the back of the head, or maybe I can't do it because you're not seeing role models, right? Or statements that are said oh, you're doing your medicine, your PhD, but are you planning on having kids? Are you going to take time off? Are you really going to do this? Which doesn't happen as much now.
Isn't that a legitimate question, though?
Not
to ask in an interview, but between, I guess, colleagues talking back and forth.
No, so I'm not talking about colleagues talking back and forth, but also that can be experienced as a microaggression, where we're talking about people asking, so where are you from? So where are you from? Not immediately, not really having bad intentions with it, right? So now coming back to that, let's link that back to racism. So for a Black child, right, even though everybody can say, oh, you can be whatever you want to be, what that child is seeing on on TV, but in their own community, in their own lives, right? Basically can recreate what I talked about, that internalized racism, that like maybe I can't do it, right? And so there has to be a lot of work done. So similar to what's going on for women in STEM, there is a lot of work being done for Black youth to like let them know, like, no, you can definitely, if you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, you can do it.
You know, it's interesting. Like, media has changed because when I don't know how old you are, but I know when I was a child, we had the Cosby Show, Family Matters, Fresh Prince.
Yeah,
there was a bunch of Black shows that showed affluent or well-educated Black people. So that was an inspiration to me. I know at that age. So, but I don't know if there's any that like those shows. I don't watch TV now, so I have no idea.
I don't watch TV either, but actually that's not enough. So that's what I'm saying. There are barriers because like you also have to think that when you're growing up, you have the role models. So so I grew up like in the 80s too. So I watched the Cosby Show, but the people who are ahead of us who would be older to say, this is what you do. Like a lot of getting into medical school starts in high school, right? As far as the advice that you get, you know, it's another term called social capital, right? Like for a lot of people, they go to a birthday party and there's people there, you know, they're 15 and somebody has advice on something, right? Or knows somebody, or you spend the summer at somebody's summer cottage and you get a summer job and et cetera, et cetera. So you get surrounded by people who not only can get you excited about that particular career, but also know the pathways that you need to take, all the steps that you need to take towards that. So it's kind of complex of like you, first of all, feeling like you can do it and then being given the resources so that you can pursue it and become it, right? So yes, you know, I was inspired by the Cosby Show too, but I could tell you that for me to get into medical school, like I went through a mentorship program that was specifically targeted at minority youth so that I understood, okay, this is actually how a doctor thinks. This is, you know, where you're going to ask me this particular question on, you know, they would ask questions about like basically testing, are you going to intervene when something's going to happen? For a lot of us in our culture, like if there's a train that's about to, you know, pass by and if you turn left, you might knock down 2 people. And if you turn right, you might knock down 5 people, or you could do nothing. For a lot of us culturally, we'll say, well, you know, we learn it's God's will, you know, like these kinds of cultural things. That's not what they're looking for at the medical interview, at least during my time. During my time. So it's different now. But what is wonderful is through, I mentioned University of Toronto where I teach, there's actually now a Black student application program where students can apply through that stream. Same criteria. So you still have to have like amazing marks and, you know, the whole thing. But on interview day, you're going to see some students from the Black Medical Student Association. So you know you're not going to be the only one in class. On the interview panel, there will be people from the Black community represented there. And they
Isn't that kind of...
Say it.
I don't know. That doesn't like. So now you're basically saying, okay, we're going to put up our token Black people when we have black candidates coming in.
Actually, no. So those Black people who are involved in interviews and things like that, they are also involved in the other interviews.
Oh, okay.
But we are, so if you think about Toronto, we're 9% of the general population. We're like 10%.
Yes.
So what is done is that there's an effort to make sure that it isn't just random chance when the Black student, like when a student who's checked off, because it's optional. You could totally decide not to even go that route. No one would know that you were Black until the day you show up. But if you were like, no, I want to check that off, I'm going through the Black student application program, you write, you know, a brief essay saying why you applied through this program, why you decided to. And then on that day, at least you see that representation. So it's more of a culturally safe environment.
Okay.
But yeah, it's not like we just pull those interviewers only. Like, ding, 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 there's a Black applicant, everybody come. No, it's actually those people are there regardless. But when you're only 10% of the population, like it's hard to redistribute. But wait, let me say. So 3 years ago, we had 1 Black medical student in a class of 250. Last year, we had 14 Black medical students once this program started. And this year, we're about to have a similar group. So it has been effective in what we suspect, because we don't know for sure, but what we suspect, because that data wasn't collected previously, but what we suspect is it's had an impact in saying, you know what, U of T, like, we value diversity. This is a safe space or safer space. please come and you are welcome, because the applicants are strong, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are Black kids with, all of the grades and everything as everybody else, but they were not coming to U of T before. And that does happen because where we talk about mental health, many of us talk about being the only one. There is pretty good evidence that where you're constantly the only one, that takes a toll compared to what's called in the literature, they call critical mass. Once you're like 5, 6, 7, like a larger group and you have more of a voice and you can have more of a say of what's going on and you can turn to somebody and be like, or whatever makes you feel comfortable, that results in better mental health outcomes as well. So I'm really grateful to teach at a university that is doing this work, but it is controversial. And exactly, you had that hesitance and where we were talking about collecting race-based data. It is uncomfortable, but the reality is we live in a society where systemic racism is here. And so if we're not measuring what happens, if we're not able to measure how much racism is going on, it becomes very difficult to address it. Where race-based data was started being collected in the UK, in the police force and in healthcare and all of that, that came through their own kind of civil rights, movement, much later than in the United States, but like in the 80s and 90s. And the data that's collected in the States also came out of the civil rights movement. So for the most part, it's groups that have felt like, we don't count unless we're counted. We can't advocate for resources until we can show what's going on. That's where it's come from.
So from a numbers perspective, if let's say the Black population is only 9% of the population, and
in Toronto,
in Toronto, so let's talk about Toronto specifically then. So let's say if the University of Toronto has 9% Black students, that's a success.
It is.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, we're not there yet.
Because
it's a class of 250.
Yeah, 14. Yeah.
So that's a success.
That is what would be deemed a success, not having 100 Black students in the class.
Well, that's a success as well. So there's no quota. So it's not like, we're just looking to have more representation as a whole, not necessarily trying to meet a specific quota. So there is no quota, but I guess Black students and Indigenous students have been identified as priority groups. So that's why you have like the Indigenous Student Application Program and the Black Student Application Program. So extra effort is made to say, please consider coming here. But there is no quota. There's no maximum. There's no minimum. There's no...
It's the best candidate.
Yeah. Okay. It's still the best candidate. So you still have to have the really, really high grades, which, to be honest, still to pull off those almost perfect grades, it's hard to do that when you're a student, living in really low income situation where you have to work at McDonald's or work here or hustle, right? And gotten into a little bit of trouble in the past and all of that. I acknowledge that this is not there yet, kind of is not undoing all of the journey that so many of us have to go through who are bright and have all this potential, but then there's all those barriers. But at least for those who have those grades, who are able to do that regardless of, what struggles they're going through on the side or not going through, at least we're seeing more Black representation and people coming from different walks of life. So we definitely have some of our students who have spoken out and been on the media talking about their journey to medicine, coming from lower income neighborhoods and things like that. So that not only helps the community, but that actually helps society, because there's also good research that where you have students who have come from diverse backgrounds, it improves the quality of healthcare that's provided, because as a physician, as the racialized or, underrepresented group in medicine, you're bringing a different perspective. You're like, oh no, this kid who's not answering in class is because he feels uncomfortable, right? Even if he walks with some swag, he is feeling vulnerable right now. Don't just assume he's arrogant and disrupting and all of that, right? Whether it's in the classroom or it's in the clinic, right? The other thing that it shows is that actually it helps your other colleagues. So for, the white Canadian medical student or a student from another group, being in a more mixed environment, they're going to learn more as well. So, other doctors will learn more as well. So there is benefit from having a more mixed class, not just for the particular group. So in this case, not just for Indigenous patients or Black patients, but for patients overall.
Well, Dr. Onye, you just dropped the hammer. Like, you just laid it down, and it was amazing. Thank you. I appreciate you so very much. Is there anyone you'd like to give a shout out to before we sign off?
There are so many shout outs, so I'm going to have to shout out groups. So definitely the group that does the work that I was describing at U of T, led by Ike Okafor. Huge shout out, and Dr. Lisa Robinson, who was our Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion. Shout out to the Black Physicians Association of Ontario, because many of these doctors are doing the outreach work involved in the community. And just also a huge shout out to Taibu Community Health Center, where I used to work previously, but a really great primary care center that provides support for community. And so it is a clinic that has a mandate to serve the Black community in the Greater Toronto area. And just, I've learned so much from being there. I've learned, from them, the biggest thing I learned is the solutions to our, any of the challenges that we're facing in the community. The answers can be found in the community. If you listen, you engage, you learn. And so that has been my biggest university, is in learning that we can just kind of learn from the wisdom within our own community.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Onye. If you would like to reach Dr. Onye or myself, JR, please tell them how they can get in touch with us.
Yeah, definitely. You can send us an email at dysh, dysh, at daintydysh.com. That's DAINTYDYSH.com. If you have any questions, we will definitely forward them over. Thank you so much for listening. We truly appreciate you so much. That's it for me. I'm done.
Well, as I said, thank you, Doctor, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That has been the dish of the day, and I hope you guys have yourselves a very, very, very happy hump day.